This episode is brought to you by Alphasense, the AI platform behind the world's biggest investment decisions. The right financial intelligence platform can make or break your quarter. Alphasense is the #1 rated financial research solution by G2. With AI search technology and a library of premium content, you can stay ahead of key macroeconomic trends and accelerate your investment research efforts. AI capabilities like smart synonyms and sentiment analysis provide even deeper industry and company analysis. Alphasense gives you the tools you need to provide better analysis for you and your clients. As yet another value podcast listener, visit alpha-sense.com/FS today to beat FOMO and move faster than the market. That's alpha-sense.com/FS.
All right. Hello. Welcome to the Yet Another Value Podcast. I'm your host, Andrew Walker. If you like this podcast, it would mean a lot if you could rate, subscribe, review wherever you're watching or listening to it. Obviously, 5 stars helps a lot. With me today, I'm happy to have on for the second time, the founder of MDC Event Driven, Michael Cohen. Mike, how's it going?
Well, it's great to be here again. It's my second time. I enjoyed it the first time. It's an honor, and I'm happy to be back.
Well, we're going to be talking airline mergers again, so you're quickly becoming a frequent flyer. I think they would term you for podcast guests. But we're going to talk. I'll get to that in a second. Before we get to what we're going to talk about, just a quick disclaimer to remind everyone: nothing on this podcast is investing advice. That's always true. Maybe particularly true today. We're going to be talking again about a legal situation. Neither Mike nor I are lawyers, though Mike may have stayed at a Holiday Inn Express last night. I'm not sure, but we're certainly not lawyers. So keep in mind, 2 non-lawyers commenting on a hairy legal situation, not financial advice. Keep that in mind. Anyway, Mike, we're having you on because you and I did actually one of the most popular podcasts we've ever done at this point was the halftime report on the JetBlue Spirit trial. You and I were talking December 6th. The trial wrapped up yesterday. Yesterday, we had closing arguments. You were in the courthouse every single day. So, you and I wanted to talk about what's going on in the trial. So I'll turn it over to you. What were your overall thoughts of the trial? And then I'll respond with kind of specific thoughts.
Well, as I recall in our halftime show, I was still on the fence, and we were just, I believe, I think we were 8 days through, and we thought we weren't quite at halftime. It turned into only a 16-day trial instead of 20. So we actually were at the halftime. And just a few witnesses after that, I became bullish for the defendants. And I feel that way consistently throughout the trial. And I felt that the closing statements, or I should say the closing arguments, they gave me actually more confidence in the position. That being said, there's I would say more people in the room are on the side of the DOJ. There's a lot of people that think this deal is not going to close, in addition to all the other problems of DOT and potential repricing. So there's a clear path to either position. I feel I like Dr. Hill. I thought he held up better on cross-examination. He was the defendant's expert, and I also think that just my read of the judge, I think he's on the defendant's side. So we'll find out when the ruling's actually issued, but it's a close call, and I would definitely, at this point, lean for the defendants.
Perfect. My internet cut out for a split second there, but assuming you didn't notice any problem, I heard everything you said, so we'll just power through. So look, it's tough because, again, you were there every day. I read your recaps every day. I know, especially after the first podcast, I think a lot of Wall Street was reading your recaps every day because the trial would close, your email would come out like 30 minutes later, and the stock would jump up or 5% as everyone who subscribes like, oh my God, the trial went well, the trial didn't went well. But neither here nor there. Again, not financial advice, just to remind people that. But I feel bad because there were multiple days of trial. There were lots of interesting things that came out, but the closing arguments were yesterday. The closing arguments are kind of the whole shebang. They're summarizing everything. So I think that's where we have to start. And, the judge, he opens the closing arguments up with questions do not indicate the inclination of the court in any way. Don't read into anything I'm asking. So of course, let's read into everything he's asking. I guess, the first thing, just your overall takeaway. I think the judge asked a lot of questions of both the government and the defense. Your overall takeaway seems to be that the judge was kind of a little bit more in favor of the defense. Like, where were you getting that read through?
Okay. There's a couple comments he made that and I'm sure other people in the room took this different. I felt that he clearly telegraphed that he saw a dynamic industry. He even asked a question of, they're asking for a permanent injunction. What would an injunction look like if I don't agree with their state of the market? Essentially saying it's a dynamic marketplace. He point blank to the DOJ, I believe twice, said he's uncomfortable issuing a permanent injunction. I came away from the closing feeling more like it might not be binary, but might be a sort of tailored decision. My read of the judge, I think he likes to have everybody happy. I don't think he wants like an in-your-face loss to the government. I think he'd be more likely to kind of have a, throw them a bone where they can get a press release if it looks like it's a good thing what they did here, even if they lost. So I'm a little bit more leaning towards we might get a little bit of a nuanced decision where the merger is allowed with some conditions. I think that the biggest question now is what those conditions would be and how much he might molest the pure play down the deal.
I am completely with you. I feel like the judge, everything he was doing here was screaming to the parties, settle, settle, settle. And it goes back to, earlier in the trial, JetBlue was testifying. I think it was their CEO who testified, hey, we thought the government would have discussions on divestitures with us. And they just never even started talking to us. Like, we crafted these divestitures all on our own. And that was sticking in my mind because the judge, he asked both sides multiple times about divestitures. And he asked JetBlue, when he asked JetBlue, they said, hey, look, we think our divestitures are fine. But if you craft other divestitures, like, yes, we will agree to them, within the scope of the contract, obviously. But they were kind of open to it. They were guiding him to what he could do. And then when he asked the defense, he said, hey, I don't want to do a permanent injunction is what he started. And then he said, what remedies do you think would solve this? And the defense came out and said, none. Like, we think the scope of this merger, the harm is so great. The only way to prevent harm is to block the merger. And I was just like, this seems like a judge trying to satisfy both sides, guiding them to settle, seeing where the middle ground is. And I was just very surprised by that from the government.
Yeah. And for that reason, I don't expect the government to settle. I even think the government might be confident in its case at this point, just as there's many in the risk bar community that are. When he was looking for how injunctions could be tailored and some guidance from them, he's like, the lawyer for the DOJ, we need a permanent injunction hard stop. There's no way to remedy the harms here. And he was adamant in that point. And the judge, to his face, I'm uncomfortable issuing a permanent injunction. Now, my thinking is you don't tailor an injunction to not have the merger go through, right?
Yes.
So it's really, to me, he's giving a path, I believe, for the merger to go through, and it's just a question under what circumstances. Is it something that would be, clearly lesser value to the combined company and then, trigger a repricing? Is it something, very minor that, is really just a face-saving gesture to the DOJ? Per the case, well, let me back up a second. I saw a different judge in there in closing arguments than I saw through all 16 days of the trial. In all 16 days of the trial, and towards the very end, he even said, I need to become an expert on the law. He needs to become an expert on antitrust law. And he asked a lot of questions that he clearly wasn't. Now, it looks like ever since we saw him last week, since then, he's been studying antitrust law because he was saying the cases that he was referring to his own study. He corrected the DOJ once on the way they saw a case. He seemed to basically accept that he has to do the, Baker-Hughes analysis and the step 1, step 2, step 3, the presumptive markets. He asked questions of how he can consider things outside the presumptive markets, but still realizing he has to stay within the Baker-Hughes framework. It was, I think that's something that's notable, that the judge during closing arguments is now much more prepared for, his ruling. And I think the questions that he asked here are then more telling than, a lot of the things that he said in the last 16 days.
Am I remembering? So I have two questions on this, and I'll leave. These were actually later questions, but I'll leave forward because they fit well here. Am I remembering the correction he made to the government was the government said something? This relates to step 3 of the Baker-Hughes test. And for listeners who don't know what the Baker-Hughes test is, I think I'm going to have Lionel Hutz back on, and we'll talk about all the lawyerly stuff related to that. So we don't need. But step 3 involves substantial harm, is, if I remember correctly, the quote. And I think the government tried to say something as reasonable, likely harm. And I think the judge corrected them and said, it's not harm, it's substantial harm. Am I remembering that correctly?
There was a correction in there. I'd have to go back to my notes to remember the specific semantics of it. Let me.
No, it's fine. And I'm saying remembering. I mean, I read your testimony, I read your recap and 3 other recaps, and I talked to a bunch of people. It's like I was there, but I was not there. I was taking care of the debate. Yeah. Let me ask my other question. You mentioned how the judge go ahead, please.
I was just going to say, one of the things that the government was saying is that it has to be timely, likely, and substantial.
Yeah.
In terms of the rebutting, which was really the step 2, and then I do think there was a correction on the step 3, and it was a slight shift in semantics, but I'm not remembering exactly what that is.
It was just interesting, but we can talk about that later. Or some. The other question I wanted to ask, you mentioned how the judge was much more prepared on case law, and it struck me too. And again, I'm only reading your testimony, talking to the people at the courthouse, but it struck me again because at the beginning he's asking, "Hey, if I want to, order additional vouchers or something, can I do that?" He asked JetBlue CEO that, if I remember correctly. Here, he's not asking them; he's asking them what he should order, and he's asking around the remedies that they would accept and everything. So he clearly got more comfortable there. I thought, reading your notes, reading the cases he cited, and actually I'll step back a second. Judges do not wait for a trial to fully end and then start writing their opinion. In general, the judges are thinking of the opinion as they're going through the trial. They're researching it. That's my understanding of how judges work. I haven't been a judge, so I don't know. But that's my understanding. Go ahead.
I believe he stated, I'm going to start working on this right away. So I got the impression he's getting a head start. He won't issue anything, obviously, before 8 days in the findings, effect, and conclusions of law. But I didn't get the impression that he was going to wait for that filing before he starts working. I think he's working on it today.
Where I was driving is he's already started researching. He's already started crafting. And to me, the way he engaged with the defense and the cases he was citing were cases that would suggest he's writing the merger can go through with these conditions. Like, those are the precedent cases he seemed to be citing. Now, I've asked a few people this and I've gotten different answers. So I just want to ask you, was that your feel? Or do you think he was also citing cases that would be hard block, or cases that would be, yes, anything in the world can go through? What did you feel about the cases he was citing?
That was my general sense, that it's allowing it. And he phrased it 2 different ways. One, which is more to the DOJ, he was saying, he was uncomfortable with a permanent injunction. What would be like the trigger event for it to, let's say if Spirit filed for bankruptcy or something like that, what trigger event did we get it wrong? And then, the injunction dissolves. So he was asking questions of how to tailor an injunction. And to the defendants, he was asking, how do I tailor a conditioned approval? He was kind of experimenting with both sides. The number and frequency of those sorts of questions makes me feel that it might not be, either a flat out permanent injunction, hard stop, or a, flat out approval. But I don't think he knew exactly what conditions, he's thinking of implying. He was really just, I think, feeling his latitude of what he could do. And both sides agreed that he has that latitude. And both sides also did not want him to go there. Both sides, wanted their full case. That being said, I think the defendants were much more realistic and flexible and said, if you find any harm, do a narrowly tailored injunction only around that harm.
Did the case,
or a condition only around that harm?
I don't think it came up in closing, but correct me if I'm wrong, it did. But did the case give any indication of, what the additional remedies would be? Because I could imagine thousands of additional remedies, but obviously it needs to be something, especially with this drug, something grounded in fact and reality. Did the case give any indication of what he might be seeing or what he might be thinking an additional remedy that would get this over the hurdle is?
So the 16 days of evidence presentation really didn't. And the reason I say that is I originally thought, and I think I still felt this way at the halftime show, that a lot of it was going to be the relevant markets. We get the experts, and they didn't rebut the DOJ's market, but they also, if you believe Dr. Hill completely, and he survived, I believe, cross-examination better than the DOJ's expert, he essentially said there is no harm to rebut. Consumers prefer JetBlue on average. In closing arguments, they made a big point of they didn't define the relevant market over a type of consumer. The relevant market is, destination to destination overlap. And Spirit customers fly that, and JetBlue customers fly that. And, his position is every time we go head to head with Spirit, we get more passengers, we get more revenue, consumers prefer us. So while they didn't dispute that there may be some Spirit customers that would be unhappy, on the whole, consumers prefer blue planes over yellow planes. And the judge had a comment to, I believe it was to Dr. Chipley, which was the DOJ's second expert, and said, am I to infer that people would prefer the rather Spartan experience of a Spirit plane over the more comfortable seating of a JetBlue aircraft? Seemingly like, how could anybody think that? And the DOJ is really just focused on price, and the defendants are focused on price for the quality. And it seemed like the DOJ didn't, count that consumers, prefer the JetBlue experience over the Spirit experience.
And now a quick break to remind you that this episode is brought to you exclusively by Alphasense, the AI platform behind the world's biggest investment decisions. Alphasense gives you the tools you need to provide better analysis for you and your clients. As yet another value podcast listener, visit alpha-sense.com/FS today to beat FOMO and move faster than the market. That's alpha-sense.com/FS.
On the Spartan comment, I sent you, but I really hope this judge is a late night host, because every late night host, whenever they want to joke about airlines, it's always, hey, if you fly Spirit, your life is at risk. Or just this weekend, this was the first Saturday Night Live episode of December. Watch the cold open. In the first 45 seconds, Wolf Blitzer, they have somebody mocking Wolf Blitzer, makes a joke about Spirit Airlines. I really do hope that. But speaking of market definition, there were there were lots of interesting things at closing. There was the dichotomy of the judge saying, hey, if this is a benefit nationally, but a harm locally, how do I weigh the two? There were lots of interesting things. But there were two kind of interesting things that came up that touched on different pieces of the trial. One was on market definition. JetBlue noted, hey, judge, a lot of what the government seems to be arguing is, the people who fly the ULCCs are going to be harmed. There's going to be a very low cost customer who's going to be harmed. I think that's what some of their experts were focused on as well. And JetBlue said, hey, judge, the market here is not defined as people who fly on ULCCs. It's not defined as people who only fly as ULCCs. Even the government, yes, they don't agree with our nationwide market, but they're doing local markets, right? So the fact that Spirit, the largest ULCC is going away, should not matter, because we have not defined the market as the ULCC market. What did you think about that comment, and how did you think the judge took it?
I myself took it very well, because I'm flying JetBlue this evening, and I have flown Spirit twice, and both times I swore I'd never do it again. So I can see where a consumer would prefer JetBlue over Spirit, but I can also see that there'd be somebody who they just want to pay the lowest price. Absolutely. And I think that the judge sees that it's going to take a little time before other ULCCs enter. I think the judge was very concerned with the timing differences in terms of harm to those customers. I think that if there is a tailoring, I think it's going to be to ensure the timing is synced between when the dynamic market can come in and replace Spirit versus when those customers feel the harm of that Spirit price going away.
Mike, this is how you know you're becoming a podcast pro, because the timing was my next question. Look, there were three things the judge really seemed to focus on. The first was he asked both sides a lot about additional remedies. I think we've already talked about that. Maybe we'll come back to it later. The second was, as you said, timing, right? And I think at one point he even said, look, I need to weigh if this is a benefit in the long term versus in the short term, if this is disruptive and cause consumer harm. And he's asked JetBlue specifically, hey, like, when is the long-term market I should look at? And he asked them a lot about the ULCCs filling in. So I can fill in some of the extra details, but I'll just ask you, how did JetBlue respond? And how did you think the judge took it on both of those sides?
So let me back up a little bit and say a little bit of what I think we can infer big picture case. I think that the market is the relevant market is going to be, destination to destination overlap pairs, essentially unrebutted by the defendants.
Surprising, because I think we thought it would be Metro, but they really didn't try to go after point to point as the kind of relevant market.
And we thought JetBlue was going to go after, national market, and yet they were comfortable staying in the location to location market. And then when we saw Dr. Hill, we now know why. It doesn't really, if you believe Dr. Hill, it doesn't matter if there's 51 presumptive markets or one presumptive market or any number between. His position is, in any market, there's more than just those. Even on Spirit Airlines, it's only 33% of their customers that are going at that rock bottom price. And in the total market, the majority of the consumers prefer JetBlue over Spirit. And so his position is, in any market, there's no harm to rebut. So if you go into the Baker Hughes analysis, and the judge believes there's a presumptive market. And let me back up on that a little bit. I don't even think that it's clear that there's any presumptive markets, because when you look at the DOJ's expert, he essentially used 1-year-old data. He didn't account that about 35 of those 51 presumptive markets, had divestitures. There's been entrants and exits on each of them. There were slides to show that. I'm a little unclear as to how many presumptive markets, if any, the defendants admit to at this point. I thought it might be,
but the government did say in their closing, hey, ignore the 51. If there's one presumptive market of harm, you have to block the deal.
And they had to say that because they knew that it wasn't 51 anymore, and the judge would be skeptical. I could potentially, I'm not predicting this, I don't think this is going to happen, but potentially you could have a judge say, there may be presumptive markets out there, but that step one is your burden. I don't know which ones they are. How can I analyze them if, I'm looking at 51 presumptive markets from a year ago? I don't know which ones are left. That could be his ruling, and it could stop at step one. Yep. I don't think that's going to happen. I think it would go to step two. And then I think Dr. Hill, who I believe stood up better on cross than I think the DOJ's expert, is simply there's no harm to rebut. On whole, consumers prefer JetBlue. And while there may be some harm to some of those people on that route, there's more benefit to the others to overcome that as a whole. And then we're off to step three, which is the DOJ's burden. And I don't think the DOJ can meet that one.
Well, I said we weren't going to do Baker Hughes on this podcast, but we're doing it. And I think you did a nice job of step one and step two. So why don't we just lay out step three would be the issue here. Step one's the government's burden. Step two's the defendant's burden. Step three is the government's burden. Can you lay out what step three is and what the government's burden is?
That might be actually better for Lionel in detail.
Okay.
But my understanding is, and there was a quibbling over the burden. The DOJ did not feel it was a preponderance of the evidence to them. They thought it was actually lesser than a preponderance.
Yep.
And it seemed like the judge believed it was a preponderance. I believe he did describe some case law in that. And so the DOJ essentially in step three has to show, but for the apparent offsetting, that there is harm to consumers.
Let me go. That was a great analysis of Baker Hughes. Let me go back to the time frame, right? So I think the judge asked a lot around time frame. He's clearly worried about hey, when will the ULCCs kind of step into the void left by Spirit? I believe the defendant said, look, Frontier said it will take them 8 years to replicate every single route that Spirit flies right now. And they did not promise to do, they did not promise come hell or high water, they will replicate every single exact flight that Spirit does. So you must block this deal. I will say, I think that's kind of ridiculous. I don't think the judge is going to say Spirit would do 50 of 51 and 5 other people would do the 51st, but we must block this deal. But that was kind of what the government was saying. JetBlue said, look, I think you need to look at 2027. You don't need to look at 24, 25, 26 and say it's starting to fill. Look at 2027. And then also consider, if we buy Spirit today, it's going to take us 12 to 18 months to start retrofitting. So they'll still be flying the Spirit kind of yellow planes for the next 12 to 18 months. And then the retrofitting happens over 3 to 4 years. So, it kind of takes us 5 years today. Merger closes 2024, 5 years, 2029. If you think the competition's coming by 2027, well, Spirit's operating through that whole time anyway. So how did you think, I want to be fair to the government. Yeah. So how did you think of both sides, and how did you think the government was responding and asking questions to both sides?
The judge, he asked a lot of timing questions, and he was very concerned of the mismatch of when people would enter and when the harm would happen. And the defendants did a very good job of shoring up a weakness there because their experts really didn't opine on that. And so he referred to Miss Ursula Hurley, the CFO of JetBlue. She was the one who said 12 to 18 months just for the single operator permit. That's when you can begin the convergence. So essentially, Spirit's not even starting to go away for 12 to 18 months. And then, plane by plane by plane, you're reconfiguring the seats, painting them blue. And the testimony was that would be like, I believe, 3 to 4 years additional time. In the closing, they then compared that to Mr. Barry Biffle, the CEO of Frontier. And while he said, 7 or 8, he also made it sound like I speculate that if, really pressed, I could do it in 5.
But let me just go on the timing. If really pressed, I could do it in 5. That was replace every route Spirit dropped, right? Because I also think he said it's going to be a feeding frenzy and we're going to be filling some of these Spirit routes within weeks.
I believe that also is only referring to his airline, as if, Frontier would completely grow into Spirit. When the reality and Mr. Biffle's testimony was, that's not likely what would happen, and that I would take over every Spirit route. It would be, like, as you said, a feeding frenzy of all the ULCCs, trying to get them going after the most profitable ones first, working their way down until essentially all profitable routes are replaced.
Sticking on the ULCC theme. So I want to come back. There were 3 things the judge focused on. We did additional remedies. We did time frame. There's one other thing, but let's stick on the ULCC frame. Stepping away from closing arguments, one of the testimonies that I thought was most interesting was the United Airlines witness. This was, I believe, JetBlue's last witness they called on the last day that JetBlue was actually calling people. They had a United Airlines person came up, and that was, I know, one of the most divisive testimonies. If you thought the government was winning the case, a lot of people heard the United witness and said, this was great for the government. If you thought the defendants were winning the case, a lot of people heard them and thought this was great for the government. We can talk about all the things the United witness said, but the one thing that jumped out to me was the United witness kind of said, hey, we're ordering a bunch of planes. And one of the reasons we're ordering a bunch of planes is because we want to expand. We want to do more of our United Basics or whatever their low cost offering is. And he said, hey, about 12% of our planes are United Basics. And I think JetBlue at closing said, look, United's got 800 planes on order. That's more than JetBlue and Spirit have combined. 12% of those are going to be basics. And there's interesting math around this, right? So I just want to kind of focus on that United testimony and how it applies to the ULCC market for a second.
The United witness he didn't, have skin in the game for either side, so to speak. He was a very honest witness. On direct, he was very favorable to the defendants. And on cross, he was favorable to the DOJ's case. My takeaway is he was a really good window into understanding exactly everything about how United Airlines works and looks at that. For the beneficial to the DOJ, it was clear that the basic seats are like an accordion. They expand when there's not a lot of demand for the aircraft, and they shrink, when there is. And so if everybody wants to be a business traveler, there's not going to be any seats for people paying less. If they can't fill their aircraft, they're going to use that basic to fill as many seats as they can. And in terms of capacity, and this is beneficial to the defendants, Spirit's planes are 200 to 250, I believe, in total. And United is ordering, I believe, 120 to 150 per year. So when you look at the capacity that the majors are bringing in, losing 30%, or I shouldn't say 30%, 30 seats, per Spirit airplanes is nothing in terms of industry capacity compared to what's coming in. And the DOJ was making it look like, that loss in capacity is just going to raise airline prices for everybody.
Just so everyone knows, Mike is referring to JetBlue when they buy Spirit and retrofit the planes, because JetBlue gives a little bit more legroom and everything. They're, Spirit flies with 150 seats on their plane. A similar JetBlue plane would have 120. And one argument the government has been making frequently is that's loss of capacity, right? Going from 150 to 120. And I'm glad you mentioned it because lots of capacity coming on. But it's so crazy to me that the government could come and say, hey, you're buying someone and reconfiguring the seats. That's loss of capacity in the market. I've been saying I want to submit a rambling, the testimony from a friend of the court or outside the court into this case, being like, Judge, if you rule for the government, you've just decided they could declare protected business models, right? Like if you wanted to buy my apartment and the apartment next door and then combine them into one apartment, that's loss of capacity in the New York apartment market. Like, could the government start ruling that that's loss of capacity? It's crazy. And this is, again, if Spirit looked at their business model and decided, hey, we need to fly 120, 150, is the government saying Spirit couldn't do that? Spirit can do that on their own, but JetBlue could not do that when they buy them? Like, it's just a very crazy argument to me. And I never really heard JetBlue attack them on that, which was kind of surprising to me.
When we saw Velo, when we saw Frontier, Allegiant, and the aircrafts they're getting, it made it look like there's going to be no loss to me of ULCC capacity in terms of that they, there's many ways of them growing in time into, filling the void that, Spirit would create. But when you bring in somebody like United Airlines or some of the majors, and I believe a presumptive route is only 30% between the combined overlap for it to reach the presumption. So there are other companies flying these routes. And it did look very frivolous in terms of trying to argue that the loss of seats from retrofitting to JetBlue planes would make any difference in the long run in price.
You mentioned that the United witness was good for both the defense and government. And I just kind of want to summarize to make sure I'm thinking about it. You thought they were good for the defense because they said, hey, we're bringing on a heck of a lot of capacity and we're excited to part of the reason we're bringing it on is we're excited to go after basics. Well, and then you go ahead.
I was going to say the case up to that point, because we had only seen ULCC airlines, it made it look like it was just, ULCCs are the only ones offering those fares. When you heard United, it really shows you that everybody's offering unbundled ULCC fares. That's ingrained in the industry. The only difference between a ULCC and the Big Four when it comes to the basic pricing is the Big Four look at it as an accordion because they'd rather fill their planes with higher paying passengers. And the ULCCs are dedicated seats. So perhaps maybe a way of a condition on the merger might be you have to have, because JetBlue also is a little bit of an accordion with its JetBlue basic, you might have to put a guaranteed minimum number of basic seats on those aircraft for a period of time until other ULCCs can come in and fill that market. That could be one hypothetical.
Which would maintain ULCC capacity. Do you think, just in this hypothetical remedy that you and I are creating in our heads, do you think the judge would order that? And again, this is hypothetical. We've never seen this done before. Do you think the judge would order that only on presumptive routes? Like, hey, JetBlue, you must keep 15% of your seats at the basics price on these presumptive routes? Or do you think he would do it on all JetBlue aircraft or maybe JetBlue aircraft that they buy from Spirit? What do you think would the trial?
I think it would probably be only on presumptive routes.
Yeah.
The DOJ tried to claim harm everywhere just from, the loss of Spirit, pretty much every route that Spirit flies. How do you remedy that if Spirit's the only one flying that?
just on the United front. So you mentioned good for the defense, and we went through that. And then I think you were saying good for the government. And that's kind of because the government said, hey, United, you play the basics like an accordion. You're not dedicated like the ULCC. That's why you thought they were good for the government, or was there something else there?
That was the primary issue, is that it showed that there is capacity, there is ULCC, pricing, but it's not a dedicated supply to the ULCC market.
Let's go back to closing arguments now. So I mentioned that the judge seemed, to me, mainly focused on three things. The first was additional remedies, which we've talked a good deal about. The second was time frame for competition, which I think we've also talked about. And the third was, can Spirit survive as a standalone? And this has come up a few times in the trial, but the judge, I think he even had something that said, hey, what if I block this merger and Spirit files for bankruptcy? And I was really interested in the commentary of Spirit standalone. And for the merger arbs out there, no, I'm not talking about this in terms of an MAE, though obviously you can start bleeding into that if you really want. I'm more talking about in terms of how the judge is going to look at Spirit's borderline distress, Spirit's poor operating performance as it relates to this merger. And I'll lead the witness a little more by saying, the government came out and said, hey, ignore that. Spirit went on a call and said, we're going to be fine and we're going to get made whole for the GTF issues. And JetBlue, I thought, had a really powerful quote where they said, an airline that is not profitable cannot grow. And they talked about how Spirit's pricing peaked in 2017 when United entered basic. Anyway, I am really leading the witness. I'll turn it over to you. What did you think how the judge was thinking about Spirit's survivability and how the sides were responding?
I think in some of the questions and the way he asked it, I think it indicated that the judge believes in the flailing firm. He sees harm, and this is, I think, one of the reasons why he is against, a hard government injunction, is that what if we do that and we drive Spirit essentially into bankruptcy? Here's a company that's been looking for a merger for an out since 2016, has it, gets the deal signed right before his business explodes on it. And then we deny that and, send them into bankruptcy. And essentially that would end up harming consumers, brought to you by the court and brought to you by the government. And I don't think that the judge was comfortable with that possibility.
So I'm with you. Here would be my counterpoint that I worry about. I worry the judge, this is an 83-year-old judge who I think is very concerned with his legacy, right? This might be his last big ruling. This is his first antitrust trial. This ruling's probably going to get cited in a lot of cases going forward. I personally think he does not want to give the government all the power I think they would imply. I think he will think through to realize the power he gives the government. I think he wants a negotiated settlement. He wants some, that's how I'm thinking. My worry is he in his head has said, I'm going to block this deal. On a narrow reading of the case law, I can find one market that's harmed. I have to block this deal. I'm going to block this deal. But I am worried about my legacy if I am the judge who blocks this deal and then Spirit files for bankruptcy 9 months later. Does that make sense? Like that's the red flag in the back of my mind saying, oh my God, be careful. Because I agree. I think it's positive. I think he's reading into flailing firm. Hey, this company is not going to grow without this deal. You can't grow without profits. But that's my worry. What do you think about that?
I completely agree with it. I think that's why that was the premise of why he asked, should there be timing? Should there be triggering events? Should there be anything, to prevent that possibility? And the DOJ wouldn't even give him that. If the DOJ was confident in its assumptions that the ULCC is a thriving business model and that Spirit is just, 1 quarter away from, turning into the same company it was 3 years ago with great continuing growth, why wouldn't it be willing to have some conditions that things can change if I'm wrong? And I felt that was a little, I think even the judge's facial expressions was disappointed in their intransigency there.
And again, it comes back to me. I thought one of the people have lost it, but one of the most interesting lines was when the JetBlue CEO said, look, it's con for us to negotiate divestitures. The government wouldn't even negotiate here. And I feel like a judge who's like a big fan of trials and the law and negotiate, like for one side, not even to negotiate, and one side to say, hey, there is nothing you could do. Like again, the government said there's no remedy except blocking this deal that would work. Really? Like, if the judge told JetBlue, hey, Spirit has 260 planes in 10 airports they fly out of, you have to divest 9 of the airports and 259 of the 260 planes. That wouldn't be enough of a divestiture. Like, and you have to divest the Spirit brand name and sell, like, you can take it or leave it. You can reject it, but that wouldn't be enough to divestiture to solve the harm. I understand that's really over the top, but there's no divestiture that can solve the harm. That does seem crazy to me, you know?
And their explanation of why there's no way to resolve the harm is simply, a specific type of consumer that they believe would be priced out of air travel. And there's no way to make it up to that individual. The problem is that's not the way they define the markets. We're having all types of consumers flying those destination to destination. And so it's a little disjointed.
I'm going to have to do some more work on it. But again, I want to submit my rambling friends of the court brief. Be like, hey, you know who's priced out of the market? My dog Penny. I would love to fly everywhere with my dog Penny, but my dog Penny is priced out of the market. You know who's priced out of the market? Like, unfortunately, people who are extremely poor. Yes, they cannot travel. They're priced out of the market. But like, it is a free market. You can charge enough to get a profit. And if some of these people are getting priced out, like, again, the seats, it's not like these planes are disappearing. It's just going to people. It's like, it's business. It's going to people who actually can produce a return on their market.
And if one company can produce a profit at that lower price, and there's a demand that's not flying, wouldn't in a free market someone else have the same capacity utilization, get their costs down the same, so that they can make it profitable for that person who's out of the market now to fly? Free markets do that, and the supply's there. And
that's the
DOJ. The DOJ argued that no one would fill it, and I think the judge did not believe that.
Let me ask you a strange question here. I want to go to JetBlue's second expert witness, who was a director of planning who had never testified as an expert witness before. It was a strange witness to me. They never came up once in the closing arguments. I was just a little surprised by the witness. It never came up in closing argument. Do you think JetBlue just like thought they were doing something different and missed, or was there a reason for that second expert?
Are you, I guess, referring to Dr. Chipley?
No, that's the government second expert, right? I'm referring to JetBlue's second expert.
Okay, got it. I thought he was an ineffective expert. He had never, as you mentioned, never testified before, and it was sort of obvious. So he seemed uncomfortable and unconfident on the stand. He did not do particularly well, in my opinion, on cross-examination. And I think, was to show the flexibility, I guess, in the network planning to help shore up the entrance as a little bit of a counter to Dr. Chipley. But the entire case, everything Dr. Chipley said, to me, seemed flying in the face of all the evidence that was before her.
Speaking of Dr. Chipley, then, so yeah, just the JetBlue second expert. I've just been thinking, like, why? I just again, let's go back to Dr. Chipley. I believe that the government. I believe she admitted. Right? It was she.
Dr. Chipley is a she.
Yep. She admitted that she did not consider this deal in encouraging new entrants, and she did not consider future market states. That seems shocking to me, particularly given how much the judge has said, hey, I'm not considering the market as it was in 2019. I'm not even considering real estate. I'm considering how it'll be in the future. It came up a little bit in closing, but how did you think the judge responded? How did you think the judge was accepting the testimony when the government witness said, hey, I'm not considering this deal on the market?
I think it was to Dr. Chipley where he had his comments. So I'm to infer that people would prefer the more Spartan experience of Spirit to the more comfortable JetBlue seating. Dr. Chipley, her entire analysis was based on growth rates that would require the individual ULCCs to fill Spirit, and then compare those to historic growth rates and say it's unprecedented, it couldn't happen. it's circular reasoning there. It didn't count for the something that's never happened before to the ULCs, which was the disappearance of the largest competitor. You would think then they'd have unprecedented historic growth rates to fill that. It seemed to fly in the face of Avello's testimony, Legion's testimony, Barry Biffle for Frontier's testimony, and the judge, he struck part of her original testimony, which was mostly just, describing the industry he thought as, wasting his time. But I think he was very skeptical of everything he was saying, because in the closing statement, he clearly sees a dynamic marketplace, which is the exact opposite of what she was trying to convey. She was making it sound like nobody can fill Spirit's shoes. And there's, if Spirit disappears, there's, the barriers to entry of pilots, planes, and others. And she just made it look like that the market was broken. And there was no evidence of that here.
The judge had two other comments that I specifically, and I'm back into closing arguments now. He had two other comments, questions that I thought were really interesting and that are going to wear the trial. We already talked about the three key questions, but there kind of are two more. The first was, he specifically said, can competition be preserved even without the exact routes of newcomers, the exact routes being replaced by newcomers? So can you preserve if Spirit's flying Newark to Las Vegas, this deal closes, Spirit stops flying Newark to Las Vegas? Can competition be preserved because ULCs pop up in 7 different markets elsewhere, and the industry's so dynamic that alone kind of adjusts for everything? What did you think of that question? And I believe he asked that of the government. And what did you think of the government's response?
Trying to remember the government's response. Basically the testimony is from the defendants is they're mobile assets. You can take planes off one route and put it on another route, and that happens all the time. The DOJ very focused on the individual routes and as if they're going to be permanent. I don't think the judge was really on board with that. I think just focusing on the individual routes like they're permanent goes against what the judge has indicated. I think it goes against the industry. I think it's just missing the forest for the trees. Let me ask on the mobile assets. There was a precedent case. I want to say it was Ball Mobility. I can't remember for sure. There was a precedent case cited to, hey, you can consider the mobility of assets. Did the defendants bring that precedent case up, or did the government bring that precedent case up? I believe that was during the defendants. That's what I thought. It was in the beginning. And, one other. Go ahead. I believe it was a chief judge of Massachusetts who may have been the one who did that. And it seemed like being through the First Circuit, it seems like that's likely to be a very important case here. I'll have to refresh on the specifics, but I do think it was the defendants who brought that up, and I think you're correct on all of that. One other question the judge mentioned, and then we can kind of do closing thoughts. The other thing the judge has to balance, and the judge was pretty clear, he's got to balance a lot of things, right? He's got to balance, hey, this might result in 4 weeks worth of less competition, but 5 years out, it might be better. It might result in 4 months of less of competition. The other thing he said he had to balance is, hey, what do I do if I find nationwide fares will get lower because JetBlue is a better competitor for all the reasons JetBlue says, Spirit's in distress, whatever reason you want. The judge said, what do I do if I find nationwide this is a benefit, but locally there are the presumptive markets, the 51 presumptive markets, there are some harms? How do I balance across those markets? And the government it immediately said, no, one local market of harm, you must block the deal. I just want to ask, A, how you thought the judge responded to them saying, and B, did the defense ever put anything on that kind of rebutted that? So the defendants presented their closing arguments first, which is unusual because usually it's a plaintiff first. That's what I thought too. I was telling someone, I thought it was really plaintiffs then defense. I thought it was weird, and I thought we might get a rebuttal because it was so weird, but yeah. I can't explain actually why the defendants went first here. But it was very early in that the judge himself started talking about that he has to do this balancing, that when he was, accepting that he has to do the Baker-Hughes analysis, that it has to be on the presumptive markets, he felt he needed to consider competition on the national level. And as he even used a word, which was, I believe, I think it's actually a citation from the case we were referring to before, and of how to manage that sort of a balancing. When he put the same question to the DOJ later, the DOJ was, you can look at evidence outside of the relevant markets, and you can look at it for how they would affect competition in the relevant markets. And they were sticking to, it has to, still be within the framework of the relevant markets. And you can't give any credit to it in terms of the big picture as a whole. The judge expressed he's uncomfortable with that. The judge, if he sees that there's the one presumptive market that you can't remedy, and the law would say you've got to enjoin that, and I'm going to stop something that's hugely beneficial for an entire industry, he seemed uncomfortable with that. And I think that's probably where he's going to be doing his homework in case law to see, what he can and cannot do. But he clearly has a desire to give some credit to how the legacy carriers would be affected,
again,
which is the real
markets
benefit of the the entire merger.
With mobile markets, it makes sense, right? If two firms combine and they're going to benefit nationwide, but in Minneapolis, they're going to create a grocery store merger. And I say grocery store because the last podcast I did was on Albertsons Kroger's merger. If they're going to create a grocery store monopoly in Minneapolis, you obviously have to block that because that's a local market harm and it doesn't outweigh the nationwide. But you've got mobile markets, right? So if Spirit and JetBlue benefit nationwide competition, bringing prices down, and they create one local market where there's harm, well, then all the other airlines are going to say, well, all of our other routes are less profitable. Let's fly an airplane on into that market to get some of those prices. And that naturally brings it down. So yeah, it makes total sense to me.
I think you hit on an important point, that the way of bringing benefits from the national to presumptive routes is the assets are mobile. In that kind of a framework, it's hard to stay, just in the single, relevant route or relevant market.
Two last questions, and then we'll wrap.
Go ahead. When benefits to competition at large, can affect all of it, because the assets are mobile.
I completely agree. Two last questions, then we'll wrap up. You mentioned at the front that you were in the courtroom, and it was kind of like you and some people on the bull side thinking that the government was going to win, and then there was a professional ARB community who were there thinking that the government was winning. And I will say, look, if you're in that professional ARB community, I talk to a lot. Maybe it's because I'm biased and I think this is going through, but reach out to me. I'd love to chat to other people who have divergent views. I love talking about this. People can tell I'll talk about this all day. When you talk to other people in the courtroom who were, again, watching the same trial as you, and when I read some bear notes, I feel like it's two different trials. What do you think they're picking up on that maybe me reading through you and other people are dismissing or seeing differently? What do you think the main divergence of opinion was?
That's what I was trying to do for all 16 days. And I was unsuccessful in doing that. I think they simply see presumptive markets. They believe there's harm just from the elimination of it and higher pricing. And they believe that harm, could perhaps be rebutted outside of the relevant market, but the law is you have to rebut it in the relevant market and can't be done. And that's a win for the government. I think that's where they're at. Where I differ is really twofold. One, I thought Dr. Hill's testimony was far more believable and held up better on cross than the government's expert. And two is my read on the judge. I think that they're not factoring in what the judge is thinking or the comments. I think they're just strictly thinking of, the Baker-Hughes analysis, and that harm can't be rebutted. And I think that if this judge credits Dr. Hill, which I think he will, there is essentially no harm to rebut. And,
we'd stop at step one is what
that's a clear win. And then the only question is the timing. If there is a temporary harm, and all the evidence at which I think the judge believes that there'd be entrance in the industry, I think any tailoring that we're likely to see is likely to be on the timing differences. And where they made it sound like, as one plane goes out and one route is lost, the timing would essentially sync. You might just have an assurance on that, such that the judge, similarly isn't surprised that, he allows the merger, and then 6 months later, it's all JetBlue planes, and that there's a period of longer term. He might require that they do the conversion no faster than they, said they would, something like that.
Yep. No, look, the few bears who I've talked to, and again, bears reach out. I'd love to chat on all aspects of this. They basically said what you said. They said, look, price is up. We've got JetBlue internal emails and deal model that says price is up. There's your consumer harm. We've got hot docs from, it's easy to forget now. I think they were largely rebutted, but we've got hot docs from when Spirit didn't want JetBlue to buy them. And you've got deference to the government. Price is up, hot docs, government deference, boom, done. That's what I say. And I say, I hear you, but I think there's more to it. And I think, again, I've been impressed with reading how the judge has managed this. And I've talked to lawyers who've testified in front of this judge who think this is a really highly respected judge. I think the judge can see a little bit further than the pure absolutist black and white prices up in a deal model. I think he can look to the real world, and I think he will, but yeah.
And now a quick break to remind you that this episode is brought to you exclusively by Alphasense, the AI platform behind the world's biggest investment decisions. Alphasense gives you the tools you need to provide better analysis for you and your clients. As yet another value podcast listener, visit alpha-sense.com/FS today to beat FOMO and move faster than the market. That's alpha-sense.com/FS.
Anything I want to ask you your odds before we wrap up, but before I ask that final question, anything else you want to say on the trial that I missed, that we should hit harder? Anything else?
Yeah, let me add something on the hot docs. I was very concerned of the hot docs coming in because they looked horrible. And it's always good when, it's your own testimony that you're trying to say is different. I thought they made a very convincing job of that was then and this is now, and explained why they, wrote the hot docs and why they felt that way. And I think the judge is going to give very little credit to it. It's basically, as if it was hearsay testimony.
People forget the government won a case 6 months ago, and the JetBlue used it. I don't think enough. JetBlue used it. Yeah. The government just won a case arguing for the JetBlue effects. That is an precedent trial now. And if the judge wants to rule this, he says, look, the government put on a great case, but let me cite this thing about the JetBlue effect lowering prices for consumers. That seems pretty clever to me.
And here the defendants were citing the government's own case in American Airlines US Air.
Yep.
And that was beneficial to the defendant. When it came down to closing, I think that the DOJ realized they didn't have a lot there. They didn't.
Never mentioned it in closing.
The hot docs were all over the opening statements. And the only thing they were sticking to in the closing is the plan. Their internal planning for the merger said there'd be a 30% price increase. And they made it sound like there'd be no new entrants, and that 30% price increase would be enduring. And that was the one remaining thing that the DOJ grandstanded on their closing.
How did JetBlue
respond to that? Repeatedly. JetBlue's response is simply that was a plan. That was before we signed the deal. That was not taking into, it wasn't a business plan. It wasn't taking into many other things in consideration. And it's, kind of cursory tangential evidence that is not descriptive of reality.
Let me ask final question. Last time we did a halftime report, you said you were at 50-50 for the odds. Here we are. We still have closing briefs, which I think are going to be important. They're extremely important, obviously. What do you think, as we sit right here, though, December 6th, what do you think the odds of merger going through, merger block are?
And that's an interesting question because how do you handle the odds for all the in-betweens? Which is
Well,
really
I will
what
tell
think
you,
that
as
they
a merger
find
arb,
out.
I will tell you, if the merger goes through and closes, all the in-betweens don't matter. The win is the merger goes through and closes, and the loss is the merger fails, right?
How would you feel about a repricing?
So you mentioned it. I've told you offline. I hear repricing all the time, right? The stock is at 14. Everybody says reprice. You need to reprice. I understand that there are ways that you can reprice, but Twitter was huge for me last year, right? You have to have a reason to reprice. And the reason for reprice is you have broken the contract in some form. Somebody needs to point me to what in the Spirit contract is going to get broken that would justify a reprice. Are you going to point me to a Spirit Mac? Well, I mean, the JetBlue CFO did not answer when asked about Mac by the government, which again, I thought was weird and did not answer, but I'm going to find it very hard to believe that the JetBlue CFO is testifying, we're excited to close this merger. The JetBlue CEO, I believe, was at the trial, was at closing arguments the other day. I'm going to have a lot of trouble believing all of that. And they're talking about, hey, we're buying all these airplanes to turn them into our model to compete. I'm having trouble believing that they're going to do all that and claim an MAE when they win. Or the other argument is the DOT is going to block this deal after the government loses this case. And then the DOT will drag this deal out past the walk date. And then you have to renegotiate there. I am hugely skeptical for all sorts of reasons. I'd have to go in offline, but in terms of let's set the recut aside. I understand a lot of people. I'm extremely skeptical. I know a lot of people think it is, but somebody needs to point me to the legal place where it is. So let's just say government judge rules, and he can rule anything he wants, but deal closes versus blocks.
Okay, let me play devil's advocate to that. If you have a conditioned deal, it's really JetBlue's decision of whether to meet the conditions or not. So they can simply say, we've done best efforts. And they could say,
the merger contract says, so what conditions are there? Because the merger contract says you have to accept divestitures up to an MAE. I suppose what you're saying is the condition is you have to fly all of your flights with 10% JetBlue basics in the presumptive markets.
If it's an immaterial condition, I would think they'd have to meet it and accept it and close the deal. But if JetBlue could argue that the closed deal is different than what it was when they
what's
signed
material
it, they could
be a
say
material
that's a MAC of the combined company. So I think it's in the judge's hands as to where that materiality lies if he conditions the deal.
I would love.
I felt that I was in your camp that it was very unlikely to be a reprice deal because I saw, Ursula Hurley, Robin Hayes, and all the testimony. They really wanted to close this deal. They were all aware of the impairment. I was very skeptical. I would say since I saw the closing arguments, my odds of a reprice deal have gone up, but my odds of a path to doing the deal have also gone up. I weigh very heavily him telling the DOJ, I'm not comfortable with a permanent injunction. And so you don't condition a deal to prevent it. You condition a deal to make a path that it can be done. The question is, what are the conditions, and does that rise to the level of something that would materially change the value of the combined company? And
I just have trouble seeing a condition that would materially change. But if you add it together, deal approved with conditions that material change plus deal approved, what would that sum to?
Approved, and basically you're saying if they're willing to accept any changes given and close it, I'd be very high. If they were willing to literally take, I think the judge is going to give them a path to close the deal. I would put that at like 80% plus. Whether the companies follow that path, if it's super onerous, they might choose not to. Or might choose to reprice. In terms of, I think the right way to look at it is when the ruling is announced, is the share price of Spirit likely to go up or down? I'd be about 60-40 that it would go up.
I don't want to do too much more there because I always feel hesitant talking about share prices moving up or down on podcasts.
And
I do want to ask you a bonus. Yeah, I do, but I think people get your. I mean, you're positive. You're bullish that this gets closed. And I think you're more bullish than the market.
I'm bullish that
as bullish as I am.
Yeah, I'm bullish that it's closed. And when I look at the current pricing, I think even a reprice deal is likely higher than where we're at.
There are going to be some Spirit debt holders who are really going to rejoice at your comments there. Let me ask one bonus question and then we'll wrap it up. Hawaiian Alaska announced a merger over the weekend that I thought was very interesting. I don't want to comment on the merger, but JetBlue did mention it briefly in their closing arguments. Did that, I could see them even mention it more fully in their closing briefs. Industry consolidating. This is further proof small people need to compete. Do you think, did the judge give that any weight or was it just kind of glossed over?
No. I think they mentioned it because, they kind of felt they had to, and it was, current event essentially. It's essentially not an evidence. It was never presented in evidence. It's only presented in closing arguments. So I don't think if they really want that, they would have to file to supplement the record and actually enter it into evidence. And so I think there is no weight on that at all.
It's also rebuttable because the government's going to say, hey, we don't like that merger either. That merger hasn't closed. We reserve every right. I think they probably will seek we probably will have another trial here, which will be referencing this ruling if there is a trial there, but neither. I just wanted to ask because that is topical and last thing. Cool. Well, Mike, again, and look, I gave glowing reviews in the first pod. I would reiterate them here. Again, I said during the pod, Mike's email would come out and it would say, day went great for defense. Day went poorly for defense. And I think some hot money traders had subscribed and would boom, 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 boom. But look, if people are reading this, the recaps were second to none. It was great. Really appreciate you walking me through this. And look, the good news is there's plenty of other interesting things out there. I've got Lionel Hutz coming on for Liquidia tomorrow, but I know you were at the Liquidia trial. You thought that went pretty well, didn't you?
Yeah, I was at that on Monday. And then tonight, I'm taking a JetBlue flight to New York. I'm currently in Boston, and I'm going to be Kenvue. It's acetaminophen, and I'll be attending that. And then finally, I can go back home to California.
There are some event-driven investors who bought the Kenvue spinoff from Johnson & Johnson and held on to it, and they need some acetaminophen for the headache that stock's caused them. But that's an interesting one as well. Cool. Well, Mike, appreciate you coming back on. Again, we'll include a link to how to reach out to Mike if you want to hear more about his service and everything in the show notes. This has been great, and looking forward to having you on. Probably not for JetBlue, but for a different trial in the near future.
Oh yeah, look forward to coming back. Thanks.
A quick disclaimer: nothing on this podcast should be considered investment advice. Guests or the hosts may have positions in any of the stocks mentioned during this podcast. Please do your own work and consult a financial advisor. Thanks.